right, so Jim, right before we hit record on this thing, during our pre-show chatter, you were telling me that we almost have a new fan, of the show, almost.
Yeah,
That is,
exactly. Somehow, maybe through an email advertisement, or I don't know that it was through Facebook. It could have been through Facebook, but somehow my mom landed on the show, and she's a client, so she might have received some notifications, and she wasn't able to actually click through and listen to the full podcast, but she did indicate we looked like we were having a good time.
that's half the. I think that's half of it. Just looking the part. It's the old last week we were talking about our various backgrounds in the theater world. The two of you indicating that you did not have one, and I indicating that I did. And one of the big things you always learned was that if you were not a good dancer, just smile. So I feel like the same principle.
I always heard, this can't be true, because what I always heard was that everybody is a bad dancer. It's just about how you feel about yourself. So maybe kind of the same idea, but there are definitely some good dancers out there, so that can't possibly be true.
That sounds like the sort of like psychological operations warfare that bad dancers would use to make themselves feel better. But like, that's what I would say. Like, I would be like, well, there's no such thing as that good dance. Just some people have more confidence, but then like, no, clearly they're actually good dancers, and I just want to make myself feel better about being a bad dancer.
My elementary school drama teacher probably told me that because I was a bad dancer, so that I would feel good about myself. And then I didn't want any drama after that. So
that's such a thing to say to a kid, like not making you feel better, like by saying that through practice you can, attain a higher quality performance, but in fact nobody is good. Don't feel bad.
And I love the smile comment, because the one thing that my mom does when she's either mad or happy or sad or whatever, she constantly has a smile on her face. So she's really difficult to read. So maybe she was no, she can dance actually. So I don't know how that applies. Maybe it's because she's smiling.
That could be it. Exactly. You're not a good dancer, or you're not happy because you're a good dancer. You're a good dancer because you're happy.
yeah,
That could be.
That's it.
Well, I think for Jim, for your mom, our almost new listener of the show, I think this is going to be the show that tips her over the edge into being a listener, because today we are talking about the distinctions between fiduciaries and brokers and who might work with one versus the other. We're getting into the nitty-gritty of Securities and Exchange Commission regulations versus FINRA regulations. And I promise your listener that it is not as dry as it sounds. This is, of course, based on an article on the site that you can read about the distinction that our own Jake Sadler here co-wrote. And I'm just wondering, Jake, if you might be able to tee us up, since you have the byline, about what exactly a fiduciary is. It is a question that we get a lot. We get asked what they are, if we're them, and why people should care.
Yeah, that's obviously a big question. We've written a good bit about it, and I can't take sole credit for the article on our blog. Dan Ebinger, our one of our other advisors, co-wrote this, and it's been a lot to unpack. I think, thanks to Dan, and I really, I think to unpack this does require, it's like a team effort in some ways, and I think so much of this conversation and this question, just on the surface, okay, it seems like we can answer this simply. Okay, what's a broker? What's a fiduciary? How are they different? There should be just some pretty cut and dry definitions. But I think as we begin to unpack it, we're just gonna discover more confusion in a lot of different ways. And I think the confusion is probably always going to be there to some extent. Who are we getting our financial advice from? If I'm kind of sitting in the seat of a prospective client or consumer, and I'm looking for financial or investment advice, I'm going to be faced with a whole lot of choices. They're going to look very similar on the surface. And then to kind of set them apart, we're going to use some kind of legalese or some technical definitions. But at the end of the day, those make your eyes gloss over. And I think from the perspective that matters, I think so much of this conversation is about trust. And I did a little bit of digging because I didn't know this offhand. It's been like 25 years since I last had Latin. So, but the root word for fiduciary is from the Latin fidere, which means to trust. Fiducia means trust. And I mean, I think that continues to point us in that direction of what this conversation is really about, is who are we placing our trust in? To, as consumers, if we're looking for financial or investment advice, who are we placing our trust in? Where do their interests lie? How can we know that they are going to provide advice or take action that is going to benefit me as a consumer or the client? And so I think fundamentally on the surface, we can define fiduciary just generally as someone who has a duty of care and a duty of loyalty to act in the best interest of the client. That duty of care and duty of loyalty doesn't exist in, say, other definitions, for example, that of a broker. So I'll just kind of stop there because I think I wanted to set the stage a little bit for what, at least from my perspective, kind of this article is really trying to get to the core of this conversation. It's about trust, trying to clear up confusion and confusion that may always be there.
Hey, Jake. Who's going to go? I'll take it.
I just wanted.
So,
I'm going to take it. Jake's.
Yeah, well, I was just going to clarify with trust. So I'm actually looking forward to exploring that a little more, because sometimes people in the prospect seat or people who are looking to get their investment advice might receive a referral from somebody, and they might just naturally trust this person. But that person may not actually be looking out for their best interest. So I'm looking forward to digging into that and helping people understand like how they can decide who they can trust, other than just being a good referral source or being referred from somebody they know.
That's such a good point. As I was kind of thinking about this before, our conversation just now, I was just kind of thinking, okay, what is trust? That's a whole, big conversation just to define that. But it quickly, at least in my mind, becomes kind of this nebulous, kind of murky idea, right? I want to think that trust is pretty easy to understand and define, because in a way, you know it when you feel it. You know it when you see it. But I think the problem exists that you can misplace it. You can misplace your trust. Your trust can be used against you. You can be taken advantage of because you trusted maybe the wrong person. And so I think kind of that trust does kind of end up a little bit more on the spectrum of kind of rationality and emotion, maybe more towards that emotional side. And so I think we do kind of need to bring in this kind of more rational component of kind of definitions. Okay, I trust you. I like you. I got a referral from a friend. Now let's just talk about, how are you compensated? Where do your interests lie? Are you going to be giving me advice that's always in my best interest? Kind of ask some of those rational kind of probing questions.
Jake, there's a lot of good there's a lot of good insights there in those two answers that you've given. But I also just want to pause a moment and highlight the fact that you took Latin. For all of our Latin fans out there.
Jake, all on the list,
fellow student of classical languages. I also took Latin way back when, so always excited. A hearty salve to our fellow Latin lovers out there.
I'm glad you mentioned classical languages, because you end up taking Latin, you end up taking Greek at the same time. It's a long time ago. I've changed.
Well, I feel completely left out because I took neither. So
hey, there are a lot of good continuing education courses out there these days. But I really like what you're saying about trust there, Jake. And it's interesting, right? Because as you were saying, it's sort of like a nebulous concept. It's sort of like densely thematic. It's emotional. It's hard to pin down. And yet, the regulatory powers that be have tried to pin it down, and have tried to pin it down in a legally compulsory and enforceable way. And I'm just wondering, Jim or Jake, if you could discuss the sort of the ways that, in this case, the Securities and Exchange Commission have, tried to bring the fiduciary standard to bear as a matter of law, and how that affects the work that we do on behalf of clients.
Well, I'm really excited to take that question and kind of close our eyes and go back in time to the era of the Great Depression, because that's where we begin to get some regulatory oversight over this kind of nebulous idea of trust, right? Let's put some definitions out there so that anyone as a consumer can begin to kind of have maybe a clearer understanding of who they want to place their trust in. So you kind of go back in time to the Roaring 20s, right? Kind of this economic boom period.
I'm there.
Coming off of the heels. You're there. So we were all kind of there in our minds, back to the Roaring 20s, off the heels of, the First World War. And it's kind of interesting. One theory on kind of all this and the Great Depression in general is that, off the heels of the First World War, in the United States, we were experiencing pretty dramatic inflation at that point in time. The cost of goods had more than doubled between the start of the war, 1913-ish, to the end of that decade, 1919. So, consumers really, just I think broadly, in America, were kind of first acquainted with this idea of inflation. The Consumer Price Index was started around 1919 to start to track this. And throughout the 20s, that idea of purchasing power, saving money in the bank, was really getting eroded, right? Everybody was kind of attuned to the fact that money in the bank, I'm losing purchasing power. How can I put my money to work in another way? And that added some fuel to the fire to all the speculation in the stock market at the time. And at that point in time, before a lot of regulation started, in markets in the U.S. and the sale of securities and investments, you would buy investments and buy stock from whoever you trusted. And there were a lot of very skilled individuals who could obtain someone's trust, but not have their best interest in mind. And this all came obviously crashing down at the end of that decade. And over the course of the following decade, throughout the 30s and into the 40s, there was a very concerted effort to let's regulate our markets. So we had, over half a dozen really, really important laws passed at the time. And the one I finally want to get to at the end of this kind of long drawn out story is the Investment Advisors Act of 1940, which regulates and puts into place a lot of important definitions for professionals who are providing investment advice and being paid for it. And in the Investment Advisors Act, it essentially defines that fiduciary duty, that duty of loyalty and care to act in the best interest of the client. Carved out of that Investment Advisors Act were some exceptions to those who could more or less kind of provide this investment advice, but not be subject to this fiduciary duty, this duty of loyalty and care to their clients. And kind of those who provided advice that was solely incidental to other work that they were doing, lawyers, accountants, engineers, and broker-dealers. So those who facilitated transactions in the marketplace, sold stock. They could essentially provide investment advice because it was incidental to their primary business of simply transacting securities. And so we kind of get this two-pronged approach for those. The consumer then was faced with a lot of people that could provide investment advice, but then this kind of fork in the road as to who's acting in their best interest, regulated under the Investment Advisors Act, and those that are really acting in the interest of their firm, but also providing investment advice. And that's kind of, that investment broker side of the world. So I'll stop there. I had a little bit of fun doing some research on kind of how we got to this point, but that's the Investment Advisors Act of 1940 is kind of really first attempt to define what a fiduciary is, and it set the stage for really those who could provide investment advice without being constrained by that fiduciary duty.
Yeah, I mean, the Investment Advisors Act is, here we are again.
We did it again. No, go ahead.
I'm claiming, I'm claiming fiefdom on this one just briefly to say that, the Investment Advisors Act is still well known and near, if not dear, to the hearts of the those in the registered investment advisory space. It's still the controlling law. What is this? 82 years later.
That sounds like the right man.
Yeah, and I was just going to just add to that is, I mean, that's primarily how most advice was given through brokers until fairly recent. I want to say, it started to change a little bit, when accounting firms and banks and additional businesses started to get into the financial services business. That was like 30 years ago, right?
Yeah, no, we've definitely seen, pretty significant shifts in just the marketplace for where people are looking for their financial advice and how they can most easily get it. I think so much of this conversation around trust and around what we're talking about does also, transparency also factors into this. And so as markets have become more transparent, the kind of facilitators of the market, the facilitators of transactions, the kind of large kind of broker-dealer firms, they were, at that point in time, there was a point in time where they were really the only ones with the information, right? They could transact most easily. They kind of had all the information that you would want to have readily at their fingertips. That's changed a whole lot. I think as you kind of mentioned, past 30 years, we can just think of the dawn of the information age and how now information is so much more readily available. And the marketplace as a whole is much more transparent than it once was. And so now, I think from the consumer standpoint, you don't have to go to kind of the keepers of the information in order to get advice that you need. You can work with someone whom you trust to have and find the information that's necessary because it's out there, and someone who can act in your best interest. Normally about transparency, because lack of transparency erodes trust and, all these types of things. And I also don't, it's an important point in the article that we did want to make is that, we're not out here to disparage brokers as a whole. This is not the point. We're not trying to kind of set ourselves as kind of the good advisors and anyone who's a broker is a bad advisor. We all are going to need brokers of one form or another at some point in our financial lives. And there are different types of brokers, right? Brokers, that kind of term is to represent someone who facilitates a transaction. You use a real estate agent, they're a broker. They are brokering the transaction. You buy insurance from an insurance agent. They are brokers facilitating a transaction. And I think kind of where it gets murky in the world of investment advice is that, investment brokers, they're there to facilitate a transaction. Their responsibility lies with their firm. That's their primary function, is to facilitate those transactions. Then they're also providing investment advice that can be very good, but it's solely incidental to the primary function of transactions.
Yeah. So, Jake, the transaction piece is really good, and the broker piece is really good. And as you were making those comments, it led me to think about how advisors are compensated, which may lead to a little bit of the misunderstanding about who you're dealing with, and a lot of those broker relationships that you talk about. I agree with you. Anybody can provide good advice and can be a great resource and can be really helpful in your financial journey. But there's that question of how are these individuals being compensated, when providing those advice. And sometimes in our industry, it has been, people have taken advantage of people to sell products and receive some sort of commission on the back end. And that they look at it more of a sales approach as opposed to, a providing advice approach.
Mm-hmm. And this, I think that's a terrific comment and a point, because again, it's kind of that changing nature of our business and our industry is providing investment advice. 3 decades ago, this was a product sales driven industry, much more so than it is today. Today, it's really, we want to provide advice. I think everybody wants to provide advice, and we all have, our clients' interest at heart. But I think this is a nice segue into the Certified Financial Planner Board of Standards and their efforts to kind of further refine and define what a fiduciary is. And so for those advisors who are, kind of much more focused on that advice piece and not on this sales and commission piece. For those that hold the CFP designation, they'll be held to the CFP board's definition and their fiduciary standard, essentially. And it basically boils down to fiduciary at all times. So you can't be taking one hat off, your fiduciary hat off, and put another hat on and not act as a fiduciary. If you're going to hold the CFP designation, you need to be a fiduciary at all times. And they expand upon just that duty of loyalty and care by virtue of the way that they've organized the standards. And so, diligence, objectivity, integrity are all really important, and competence is really important, and essentially kind of a subcategory of the definition for a fiduciary. So now, if you are looking to a certified financial planning professional for advice, I think there's a much more reasonable expectation that they're going to act in your best interest. And furthermore, that if that professional, if you have a question for them or a situation that's outside the bounds of their area of competence, they won't go out on a limb and just, take a, shot in the dark as to what the good advice might be. There is a duty to go out and find a resource that will then provide the essential advice to the client. So, kind of stay within the bounds of your circle of competence, if you will. So I think that the Certified Financial Planner Board of Standards has really kind of gone a long way to, and this is very recent, 2020, these new, this new definition for fiduciary rolled out with the CFP board. I think this goes a long way to kind of help further, hopefully instill trust in consumers.
And, all of this is made, yet more complicated due to the fact that financial advisor is not a protected term of art, right? I mean, it's not like lawyer or attorney where, there is the expectation that this person has a Juris Doctor degree and has, probably passed the bar exam, or doctor where there's the, expectation that they have a doctor of medicine terminal degree. Anyone can call themselves a financial advisor, a CFP certified fiduciary financial planner call themselves a financial advisor, but so can an insurance agent or a broker or an annuity salesperson. I mean, I think I saw recently an article about the Financial Planning Association, trying to get protected status for the term financial planner, which would be a matter of legislation to protect that. And then, the fiduciary standard, you would have to, adhere to that in order to call yourself a financial planner, but, that's years in the works to get to that point. So it makes it very important. And I think the article does a good job of, explaining this, that, if you're sitting down with someone, a financial planner or a wealth manager, one of the first things you should ask them is, are you a fiduciary? If that's what you need, if what you want is advice, not just someone to transact on your behalf.
What's the flip side of that definition? You just have to provide suitable advice. I mean, you can explain that a little bit more. So what is everybody else held? What's the standard that everybody else is held to if you're not a fiduciary?
Well, yeah, so kind of back to kind of some of, federal laws around, those who do provide financial or investment advice. And so under the Investment Advisors Act, fiduciaries have that duty of loyalty, duty of care to act in the best interest of their clients. Those who kind of have that exception to the rule, they're held to this suitability standard as it's known. And this is kind of, I think, a much vaguer, more vague definition around, kind of what advice is being provided to the client. It doesn't have to be necessarily in their best interest. And so there is that suitability standard that's out there, and many who are providing investment advice, say as brokers, are held to that standard as opposed to the standard that requires the advice is in the best interest of the client.
Yeah, so the real difference is that if you're held to the fiduciary standard, you really have to put your client's interest first, and you really have to make all decisions with them at the forefront of your advice. And you're not selling them a product to line your pocket. You're evaluating their situation, and you're making sure to the best you possibly can using those other rules that, your competency and and your objectivity and those standards to make sure that advice is correct for your client.
That's right. And I also want to kind of piggyback onto that idea, which is if a potential conflict of interest arises, as a fiduciary, you are legally obligated to put it out there on the table. This is a potential conflict of interest. As an advisor, I could advise you in one way that's in my interest or another way that would be in your interest. And I think that kind of the quintessential example is that question that we get a lot of times. I've got my home mortgage and I'm really interested in paying it off. But in order to pay it off, I would have to take a distribution from my managed portfolio that I'm paying my advisors a fee on. So from, the advisor standpoint, there's that potential conflict of interest. You could say as an advisor, no, don't take the money out of the portfolio. That's where I'm charging a fee. Don't pay off the mortgage. That's a terrible idea. When that question comes up, we just put it out there on the table. This is a potential conflict of interest. Let's look at the numbers. Let's let the actual numbers and the personal preference and objective of the client drive the recommendation. So you could crunch all the numbers. You could say, okay, this is a low interest rate. You kind of have this opportunity cost where if you paid off this low interest rate on your mortgage, maybe you kind of leaving some potential, growth out of the portfolio. And so you can look at the numbers perspective. Then you can get the perspective from the financial plan and say, okay, well, it doesn't derail anything if you make this decision to pay off the mortgage. So it's really a personal preference. What's important to you? Are you losing sleep at night over this? And some clients say, yeah, I really don't want this. This has been a goal of mine ever since I started. I bought a house. I don't want a mortgage. And that's it in a conversation. Money's out of the portfolio. They're paying off the mortgage. It doesn't derail their overall objectives. So we need to take their instructions and be attuned to their situation so that we can provide advice that's in their best interest.
Yeah, that's a really good example, Jake. And it's one where, taking money out of a portfolio, you wouldn't think that somebody's going to make that or steer you in one direction or the other, but it would affect that advisor's compensation in one way. It could affect that advisor's compensation. So you really have to keep those things in mind when you're making those decisions, and being held to that fiduciary standard is helpful to know.
Mm-hmm. And I think it just comes back to that idea of transparency. You just, if you want to place your trust in someone to help you navigate through your financial life, ask those rational questions about how they're compensated, where their loyalties lie, and then, at every juncture, look for transparency. If there's a lack of transparency, to me, that's a signal to dig deeper. But where there's transparency, I think that helps to facilitate and build trust.
And because we here at Conversations with a Data Point are always looking after the best interest of our listeners, I have to be fully transparent and say that our time has unfortunately come to a close. So as ever, thank you so much for listening. And thank you to my castmates, Jim Gantowski, who joined me here in Annapolis, Maryland, and Jake Sadler, joining us from way downtown in Asheville, North Carolina. We will see you again next week. Thank you all for listening.
Yeah, I want to just thank Jake for carrying that conversation. That's some really some great detail he had, and some really good knowledge of the history of the Investment Advisory Act. Good job, Jake.